Well, it is now 3:30, which means it's time to start another episode of the Vinimark webinar. This time we're talking about the future of on-trade in the South African wine industry. Now, over the last year, restaurants, tasting rooms, and wine bars have done absolutely everything that they can in order to embrace the online space. But the fact remains that they still need to be profitable in the realms of brick and mortar. Now, as scary as the last 15 months have gotten, human beings, stubborn creatures that they are still leaving the house, crossing that crazy, barren urban landscape, and doing the darn groceries. And I guess the question that our team has been asking in the run-up to this webinar is, how are these intrepid urbanites shopping in a COVID world? And how can wine estates, restaurants, and retailers capitalize on the changes in these behavior? Because the game has undoubtedly changed. I mean, as was the case with the e-commerce sphere, we've had a sprinkling of successes here and there, but for the most part, the South African on-trade scene has witnessed widespread decimation. Amongst the more notable examples were Balthazar Restaurant and also Mosaic, the first being famous for having the largest by-the-glass wine list in the entire Southern Hemisphere, and the second one being possibly the most internationally awarded South African restaurant of the last few years. So it seems like no one is exempt from the pressures faced in the on-trade space. But the purpose of this webinar now is not to rue the past, but rather to look forward and plan for the future. So we want to take a look at how the on-trade has shifted, to analyze the operators who seem to have clutched profitability from the jaws of insolvency. And as ever, we want to get practical insight from experts on how consumer behavior is changing. So to help us through, we have a quite impressive panel of retail and hospitality specialists. Joining us today, we have Robert Joseph, who's an international wine journalist turned industry analyst. He is also one of the driving forces, along with Polly Hammond, behind the YouTube channel, The Real Business of Wine. Then we have Matt Manning, a Cape Town chef, restaurateur, and serial entrepreneur. We have Ross Baker, the managing director of Wild Peacock Products and the Wild Peacock Food Emporium, and Miguel Chan, who is the head sommelier for the Tsogo Hotels. And finally, Paula McKenzie, all the way from KwaZulu-Natal, who is confusingly Vinimark's on-sales manager for Gauteng. So guys, thank you so much for being here today. I thought I'd start off the conversation by trying to get an accurate view of the situation that we're actually in with regards to on-trade. I think there has been a fair share of tall tales from both sides of the spectrum, sometimes to inspire consumer sympathy and sometimes to inspire investor confidence. But either way, I wanted to ask Paula McKenzie to report on what she and her team have actually seen on the ground in Gauteng. Paula, I was looking at some of the stats that were released by the Restaurant Association of South Africa, and they were estimating that by February earlier this year, 3,600 of its members had closed their door due to level 3 restrictions. So my question to you is, does this statistic resonate with you and your team and what you've experienced over the last 6 months?
Well, no, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think nationally, our numbers are tracking around 700. I think in level 3, there were a lot of places that chose not to open. So there are many lodges that are very reliant on international tourists who have chosen not to open, but they certainly haven't liquidated or gone bankrupt. So they're still there, they're still operating, but it just doesn't make sense financially to open the doors and, you know, have 2 guests. So I think realistically, there's certainly been some decimation. And I think one of the biggest challenges has been staff. I think there's been a lot of staff that unfortunately haven't been able to be kept because of the fact that the restaurant sizes have had to change. So I think 3,400, yeah, that's a big thing. I suppose also we probably only measure licensed premise. So maybe there's a lot of coffee shops, you know, and airports and that kind of thing that have closed. But realistically, licensed places, our numbers sit at about 700.
Yeah, so I mean, that's how it's felt as a consumer in the street. When I go out there, it felt like that was a bit of an exaggeration, and there seems to be a recovery of sorts. And I think we talk about the Spur Group as an example. They were saying that they were back to 92% of year-on-year trading figures, which is remarkable, it would seem, for a group of that size. And they're having plans to open another 21 restaurants in this year. So it doesn't feel like all doom and gloom. But you would have seen guys who have both failed and succeeded. And I wondered if you could give me insight into your observations on what have been the elements that seem to separate those that float from those that sink.
I think my team and I have basically seen the guys that were prepared to acknowledge that we were not going back to normal. In 3 months' time, it wasn't going to be normal. So basically, if they were happy to adjust, use their outdoor space more effectively, and stick with protocol that seemed to be very important, and make sure that their service, food, price, wine list was at the same standard that they had been pre-COVID. I think many people cut some corners and tried to change their model too much. I also think people that embraced takeaways really did build a loyal following amongst their communities. And we saw that being very successful. People have eaten in different places. I mean, if you're not driving into a place like Sandton every day to work, you're probably not eating lunch there, but you're still eating out with your family and closer to home. So we certainly found people that engaged well, got onto social media, and really created a community, have survived and really done well. And I mean, there's been people obviously offering quite good specials from more of a hospitality point. And I think that's also driven locals into the environment. But for us, it's definitely about people that have kept the quality at the same level as pre-COVID.
You mentioned embracing takeaways quite a lot, but obviously that's a problem for on consumption license holders, in that they're not able to offer alcohol for takeaway. Have you seen guys with creative solutions to get around that?
So we agree. Initially we were very stressed. We were thinking, all these people are going to drink at home, they're going to buy from online retailers, they're not going to support the restaurants. But what we've seen is people really started to get to know the menu, they started to get to know the staff when they were collecting their takeaways. And so in some ways they got closer to the restaurateur. And the restaurateur is now coming back and saying, this guy eats with me 3-4 times a week. He was telling me about this particular wine farm. I'd like to include their wine. So we found that there was more conversations happening from a wine perspective with their consumers. And we also found that people were quite clever with selecting wines that are already on their menus as suggestions for people to drink. And therefore, when they came back to the restaurants, which we saw in level 1 and 2 particularly, we saw those sales really start to increase. And we actually saw in some cases higher wine prices through those spaces as well, which was very promising for me. And I suppose people are starting to understand restaurants a little bit better because they're frequenting it, collecting, and getting to know the people a bit more.
So you mentioned the businesses that did the best had made adjustments to food, to price, to wine lists. Do you mind expanding a little bit on what the smart adjustments were as far as you could see?
I think for smaller mom and pop restaurants where cash flow and keeping staff and whatever was a bit of a problem, the guys reducing a wine list, making a little bit more tighter, getting the staff to understand the wine list, making sure that the training was really well done and everyone knew what was happening, and making sure that that stock was actually in their restaurants. We saw that being a real positive. We also saw that when people started to open up again, they would bring back sort of slightly higher priced wines as well. So they were listening to the consumer and seeing what was happening. There was certainly quite a lot of adjustments. There were many restaurants that people used to eat at quite regularly that they maybe have stopped doing that and maybe are eating only once a month, and therefore spending a little bit more and spending a little bit longer in the restaurants than sort of the short in and out glass of wine and actually ordering a bottle. So from our side, we saw people just making changes and also being a little bit more selective. So instead of having 20 or 30 menu items, bringing it down and specializing. So really making sure that the quality of the food was really good. And therefore, when you were recommending wine, you were also looking at those 10 or 12 wines rather than trying to, sort of have it all fit all, trying to have 22 wines to suit everyone's palate. They were sort of specializing on what they were doing, which I thought was very clever.
Thank you, Paula. So I want to ask Robert Joseph to chip in here. Robert, you spend a lot of your time chatting to wine producers from around the world. And in fact, your initiative, The Real Business of Wine, was one of the first initiatives to shine light on what was happening here in South Africa in the early parts of 2020.
The very bad, the early bad days before you had the later bad days.
Correct. Yes. So, I mean, I imagine being in that line of work, you get a beautiful bird's eye view of some of the more developed wine cultures around the world. Do you feel optimistic for the future of places like?
Yes, and well, I think let's look at things separately and break it down. Firstly, there's producer countries and consumer countries. In the UK, whatever we can talk about, English sparkling wine is a consumer country, and the US is obviously mixed consumer and producer. So we've got a geographic issue, and with COVID, obviously different countries are at different phases inevitably. Secondly, I think we have some things that we really have no way of understanding yet in terms of the economic fallout. Now, if we compare what we've gone through in the last year to the recession of 08, 0809, one of the big differences was during that period, although there were some pretty successful financial people who came out okay, most people were affected. At every level of society, there were people losing jobs or losing income and so on. This time, it doesn't seem that way. And I can't talk about South Africa, but from what I'm seeing in the UK, US, and elsewhere, people at the top of the pile who were able to work at home, whose income actually wasn't, who went on working, they actually have more money today than they had before all this started, because they've actually been getting it in, but they haven't been spending it. They've not been on holiday, they've not been out to restaurants and so on. So those people may have a lot of money to go and spend in restaurants when everything really opens up, which we're, in the UK, we haven't really got there yet. That's the first thing. On the other hand, we've got the people at the other end of the scale, and many of them who've not, we've had a generous furlough scheme here, but it hasn't covered everyone. And we're going to have a lot of people who've got less money than they would have had there. So arguably, we've got a more unequal world than we had. That's going to raise some questions. Secondly, I think we've got behavioral things that we have all been affected by. You know, they always say if you can develop a habit over a few months, it's hard to lose it. What will that mean? So some of the things we're talking about, will we go on doing more eating at home? Now, until now, our dinner parties have been basically us and our families for obvious reasons, but we've been cooking more. You know, we've been opening good bottles of wine at home. Will we be doing that more for our friends rather than meeting them in restaurants and going out with them? That's going to be an interesting issue, especially back to that inequality thing. If I know my friends don't have as much money as maybe some have more money than others or whatever, maybe the idea of going to a restaurant may not work for everyone. So is that going to drive more of us to doing things at home? I think there's another question where, and Paula, you made a big point about mom and pop restaurants. There's a question of whether this is going to be a situation that helps the chains, that helps restaurants with deeper pockets that can, or chains of restaurants where they can actually afford the staff, the cash flow, and all those sort of things that a smaller restaurant struggles with. And you, again, Paula, made the point about reducing wine lists. I think that's something, reducing menus, reducing wine lists, may be something that is a trend that's here to stay. And you know, we went down the Wine Spectator, how many thousands of wines can I have in my Bible? But you know, who is that for, really? You know, that was just a showing off process. Very nice for a company like you, Vinimark, maybe to be shipping wine into all these places. But if that wine isn't moving at some point or other, all they've got is a full cellar. So I think that may well be an interesting area. So we now have this question of, are we running into the roaring 20s? Are we going to have all those people with that pent up cash running out to spend it? And I suspect in London, New York, and maybe Cape Town, Joburg, you are going to see some of that. But the question is it going to be as big as some people expect it to be? I mean, the Champagne people have had a really rotten time in the last year. Are they going to actually benefit from this or not? I think there's a question also in terms of communication. We talk about online, you know, people ordering online before they come to the restaurant. consulting menus, which a lot of people didn't do before, they're now doing. Now they're doing it maybe for takeaway, but now in the future, they're going to be doing it in terms of what am I going to eat and drink in the restaurant. I think that's a potentially big change, and that may raise issues for apps. You know, what Vivino has already moved us into looking at what restaurants charge for wine, and that, you know, markups become an interesting issue there. But will we begin to see more attention in that way? And in the restaurant, do I want actually, if you give me an iPad which you've wiped down, do I prefer that to handling the book that everybody else has handled? And if we are going to move into iPads and other forms of electronic wine lists and material, is that also going to open the door to new forms of communication? Because will I be seeing little videos of the wine farms? Will I be seeing things? Because I sit in the restaurant for a while when my friend's gone off to the toilet or they're late or whatever. And then that moves me on. And you talked about Balthazar, which is, I'm really sorry to hear go because I've had some great moments there. But that's one kind of wine by the glass, which ties in with my 1,000 bottle list. But I'm fascinated, and one of the things I'm getting very focused on is another form of wine by the glass, which is funded by producers. And I think the world has never really picked up on this in the way that it could have done. It was the model was invented by Mondavi in the 80s in the US, and they really imposed the Mondavi brand and its Chardonnay by putting wine by the glass in so many restaurants and effectively funding that exercise. And there were tent cards and everything else, and they owned the market, but they built a market that they owned. And I'd like to see wine farms in South Africa and wine producers everywhere really sitting down and talking to distributors like you at Vinimark or everywhere in the world, saying, how can we as producers actually communicate via our wine to consumers by giving them a chance to taste our wine? So they don't have to take a risk on a bottle of our wine or listen to a sommelier. They can actually get a glass of it, maybe a small glass for a taste, and decide whether they like it or not. And I'm trying to think about that for my wines in the US, talking to our distributors. It isn't easy, and there are a lot of questions, and we need to talk about how we're going to store the wine and all the stock issues and so on. But it's an area that I think deserves a lot more attention than it's had.
And I mean, does that involve, would that involve potentially a change in the way wine is packaged, or even the way
Jono, that's a brilliant question, because I mean, it depends. I really don't think that at the top end, we're already, the whole issue of screw caps is already enough of a question for many people. And I suspect at the top end, it's still going to be 75 centilitres in glass with a bit of wood in the top for a while yet, even if that bit of wood is a Diam or whatever, something like it. But I do think that there's going to be a lot more draft. There's going to be a lot more bag-in-box. And at different levels. And apart from anything else, environmentally, essentially, you know, the people talk about, Jancis Robinson and Tim Atkin are good friends, but they talk about, you know, the evil heavy bottle. The evil heavy bottle is like the Porsche or the Bentley of this issue. There aren't that many of them. You know, we point them out and say, well, that's a gas guzzler. But actually, all of those Fords and all of those Volkswagens going down the road are doing more damage. And all of the cheap wine that we're seeing that is in glass bottles is doing far more damage than the small number of heavy ones. So I see a lot more wine going into alternative. And so the Bagnum, the bag-in-box without the box, effectively, is picking up in the States. And one of the things, again, I haven't seen done elsewhere very much, but the brilliant Jean-Charles Boisset, the Burgundian now based in the States, in California, came up with wooden barrels that sit actually invisibly in the restaurant, but with a bag-in-box inside it. And he was selling some nice wine in that form. And you don't, you know, you can see the bottle and the name of the wine is on the outside. And so I think we need that kind of initiative because there's no reason why we can't actually go higher up the level. Again, in the States, we see growlers, what they call growlers, where people take their bottles to a winery and they're getting $20 and $30 wine which they're going in with their bottle and having a new bottle filled up and taking it away. I think we've got to start thinking far more along those lines, environmentally and economically.
Yeah, well, I think when you mentioned about the way Mondavi had kind of dominated the market by funding a kind of by the glass service regime, I often think that it's, again, the bigger guys are more able to do that than perhaps your smaller artisanal wine producers. I wondered if you'd seen any of the smaller guys who really were agile and able to create clever solutions without
not very many and very easily, but I think a lot of them are doing it online. A lot of them, yes, if you're nice, that's why I said earlier on, unfortunately, the fear is that the giant winery talks the giant retail chain and the giant restaurant chain, well, not necessarily giant, but big guys like dealing with big guys. But the small guy, hopefully doesn't have that many bottles to sell. So maybe he can actually talk to one or two restaurants and say, can I come to an arrangement with you? Because essentially, if we're talking about pallets of wine rather than containers, it's 10 bottles today and next weekend, another 20 bottles and so on. You do that in 2 or 3 restaurants and you're beginning to create something. And I think the other question really is the relationship building that is happening now. And we're seeing it is actually understanding who your customer is. And we are so bad at that in the wine industry. And sommeliers, and Miguel, who I know from, is one of the good guys, and good sommeliers who, when people come into his restaurant, he is a psychologist. He's looking at these people when they come in and saying, look, he's out with a business colleague. They don't want to talk about wine. They've got business to talk about. He wants to impress the girl he's just brought out this evening, but he doesn't want to spend a lot of money. And so all that stuff, he as a sommelier understands that. But we as an industry need to start thinking a lot more like that. Amazon and Netflix know so much about us because they're watching what we do. As a wine industry, we need to get into that sort of thinking. What does this person want out of us? And it may not be the same thing. He or she may want something very different today to what they want next weekend. And we need to be there to supply that. On one day, they want to be told a story and all that stuff we hear about stories. On another day, they absolutely don't. They want something. They may want actually just a simple solution to a thirsty problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, maybe now is a good time to bring Miguel in to get his thoughts on things. Miguel, as the head of the head sommelier for the Tsogosan hotels, you're responsible for alcohol service to what is usually around 40 properties, if I understand it correctly. But
Correct.
I know that that's changed since COVID. Tsogosan announced
I lost you here.
That their headline earnings have dropped. I was saying things haven't looked great for Tsogosan in the past. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I can hear you.
So up until recently, things haven't looked great, but there seems to have been a recovery. Can you tell me what your experience has been for a large group like the Tsogosan Hotel and what your wine sales have been, how they've been performing?
Yes, thanks, John. First of all, thanks for having me on such an esteemed panel. And yes, the last 12 months have been an unusual year of trading where I don't think in the living experience of any sommeliers or hoteliers we've been through what we've seen in the last 14, 15 months. The reality is in March of last year, over 90% of our hotels were closed within a week. And then for nearly 3 months, and in June, we start reopening slowly. And to date, we have about 60% out of the 100 properties nationally that have reopened. And we are trading slowly. We are trying to get back to normal. Occupancy have been supported by domestic travel, which has been rather dynamic because we don't really have much international visitors right now. And pretty much have been nailed or said by Paula and Robert about the evolution and how consumers are changing, evolving with COVID itself. In our own case, what we've seen is besides the free alcohol lockdown, First, it was a stop-go, there's a slow restart to the trade, and consumer people were eager to go out. There was a first out there to get out of the home, to entertain reasonably with social distancing, meeting with their friends or their families, having little celebration or festive days, festive weekends, where they would book for let's say from Thursday to Sunday. So Thursday to Sunday was kind of a leisure traveling, whereas Monday to Wednesday was business travel. Yet we still have a long way to go. As much as the hospitality industry have been hit quite brutally worldwide, the truth is people have to travel, humans have to travel, men needs holiday, and we as mankind, we have to go out. We love dining, we love wine, we love interacting. I believe it's going to go, we are going to come back stronger. We're going to be back quicker than what have happened in the last 15 months. That said, with recovery itself, what we've seen is areas like Centon, obviously the richest square mile in Africa, have shown what it is, the disposable income. People want to be in the restaurants. We are virtually back to pre-COVID in our Centon properties in terms of wine sales, in terms of food sales. And that's we had to listen to the consumer. Yes, the menu changed. We had to reduce the menu offering, both the wine list and the food offering. We've seen, as an example, with wines, especially in an organization like ours, with over 40 properties still to be reopened, we have to help our colleagues with Close Hotel moving their stocks and also looking at what the consumer wants. And those days is about trying to be creative and having a wine list of, it's a one-pager list. Gone are the days, as Robert mentioned, the book. We used to have a book of 30, 35 pages, 300 wines, 250 wines. This is gone. It will never, ever come back. This is the new normal. The new normal is about having a short page. Currently, we are offering 80 wines on the list. It's a one page, printed both sides, and it can be reprinted daily or weekly. As the stock gets depleted, we replace where it needs to be. Something that Paula mentioned was about the premiumization. What we've seen with COVID and what we've seen with the alcohol restriction is there is an eagerness to spend. Consumers have upped the game. They are spending more on wines that they would normally not drink before. They would go for the lesser price one. We've seen the increase in luxury champagne, in cognac, and equally our top wineries. There has been a migration towards higher price wine, and also by not repeating the purchase and taking out wines and replacing it with something else, coming either from a Close Hotel or we just added to test the market, it's working. So it is working both sides, for the consumer, for the industry, which is something I believe, and I've heard it's been an ongoing discussion in the industry, the premiumization of South African wines in terms of its pricing strategy. It is a long journey, but it is happening slowly. And what we're seeing now is wine lists probably will get shorter than that. When I say we started with 80 wines, we are looking ideally at around 40 wines on the wine list. Wine by the glass is the same. We've seen the premiumization in terms of the pricing and also replacing wine with similar brands, similar quality, without making the consumer feel that they've been left out or forcing them to drink wines that they are not willing to. So we've seen that there is a better and a bigger acceptance either for the bigger brands or for the boutique wineries or for the garages for that matter. There is a fine balance out there. There is almost a notion that we don't know when the next lockdown will happen. Rather enjoy the now, rather have fun, have a good bottle of wine. And if it's out of stock, there's a better understanding. Prior to COVID, consumer would be more unflexible. Should something be out of stock or should something not be available on the list? Now there is almost the understanding that, okay, the supply chain is disrupted. And the reality is we all have to work together from the distribution point of view, from service point of view. And something succinctly that Robert mentioned is the psychology of the consumer. crucial, critical for a sommelier is to read the consumer's mind. It's not to, we have to anticipate their needs. We have to understand. And that's how, and that's where we make the sales. We go, we recommend, and we upsell. And the other aspect where we have also innovated has been the creation of chef table, chef dining experience. With social distancing, and in places like in Centon, where we have an open deck that can sit 400 people pre-COVID, now we have kept it to 200. Chef table is something that is private, in a kitchen, 10 people, they are away from the public, and they can have fun and in all the privacy and having great wines, great food. So these are things that we are tweaking as we go along, and certainly exciting, certainly the reality, the uncertainty will continue to play around us for quite a while to go, until I guess most of us have been vaccinated. Until then, it is the new normal, and the new normal is about minimalistic and offerings based on quality and based on the reputation of the brands and the sort of the wines.
Well, I mean, that's hugely encouraging to hear that people are spending more per SKU, I guess, because I mean, for the most part, people have experienced the opposite. Now, with Torgo Sun Hotels, you obviously have 3 tierings, 5-star, 4-star, and 3-star. I'd be interested to know, have you seen even recovery across that level, or is there a sense that one division is doing better than the next with regards to sale of wine specifically?
One division certainly doing better. What we've seen, there has been a drive from consumer to actually go dine and be seen in the 5-star properties. The 3 stars is mostly for just to stay over. It's a bed, it's a breakfast, and then they're out the whole day. They would rather have their lunch and dinner in a standalone restaurant or somewhere else whilst having their meeting. In the 4-star, it's been quite selected because quite a lot of our 4 stars are not service hotel. So either we have the food and beverage offering being managed and delivered by a third party. Alternatively, what we are seeing also is, like I mentioned, in the 5-star properties, is that's where we're seeing most of the footfall happening within the limit that we can accept on a daily basis. Yeah.
So even there, the 5-star tier seems to be performing better.
It is definitely performing better. So what we've noticed is, obviously, being closed for nearly 3 months, there is the cash flow thing. We have to look at stocks that are not moving. And yes, when you have a big wine list, you're carrying in excess of R1 million at least of stock. And these are the days where it's gone. And the truth is about making the stock move. And when we reopened last year in June, obviously the lower price item was first to move out. And the next decision was, do we continue buying the lower price, or do we simply remove them out of the list and replace them with the higher price item and see what the consumer reaction would be? And we went for option B. We removed the lower price item. We replaced them with the higher price. And surprisingly, there hasn't been any resistance. It's something that we were anticipating, thinking that somebody will leave a bad review saying that they don't have a choice to have, let's say, a bottle of wine at under 300 Rand a bottle. But 450 is kind of the average price today where people are comfortable to pay for a bottle whilst having a simple dinner. We're not talking of a celebration here. And we're seeing that there has been a shift that if they are entertaining or having a business meet, they definitely are moving into the higher price bracket, which was not seen before, even in Centon, where, you know, it's the most dynamic place to sell wine in South Africa. That's where all the action happened. It's the showground, and it's pleasing to see, and everyone is a winner. And fingers crossed, it may long continue.
So it sounds like you guys are definitely in a good space, which puts you, Miguel, in a fairly prominent position of power as the person who decides what goes on those wine lists. You're managing to engage with your consumers. So my question is, for wine producers who are listening, what are they going to do? What can they do in order to position themselves best? For you to look at a list of producers and go, these are the guys I want on my list for these reasons. What are the things, what are the qualities in a producer that stand out?
First thing first, Jonah, is what I would say the power lives in the hand of the consumer. I'm just in between the producer and the consumer here. And yes, we are listening, and we bring wines and we look at what's happening in the industry. My message to the producers out there is work out your brand. And something that Robert mentioned earlier, the relationship from wineries and how people look after their brand. Unfortunately, and I'll say that in a way that producers are not really dynamic in terms of working their brands and working and positioning their product. And the quality is exceptional in most cases, or has improved consistently over the last 5-6 years. The truth is they need to stick the neck out and be more confident and be more pleasant about their offering. I'm not talking of arrogance here. I'm saying have the faith into your product and you make use of social media. If you look at the industry as a whole, I would say from my experience of 18 years working in South Africa is less than 10% are active on social media. Less engaging with the consumer or talking about the positive side of their brands and their product. They do that, there will be interest from the consumer. It will make their brand sexy. It will be easier for us sommeliers and hotels to sell the wines to the consumer. So the truth is, the effort needs to come also a big part from the industry. Quality is one thing. We've all witnessed our quality having dramatically in our industry, but we need to work out the brand. We've seen great wines where everyone rave about it, 95-point plus wines, but I can tell you some of them, they are dead bottles on the wine list.
Well, I mean, the overriding thing I'm getting away is a huge amount of optimism here, which is really encouraging. And I thought now would be a good time to bring Ross Baker into the conversation. Now, Ross himself is the managing director of Wild Peacock, and traditionally they've been a business-to-business supplier that shifted their business partially to focus on the end consumer, because everyone was saying, hey, this is what you have to do. You have to go into e-commerce. You have to go straight to the consumer. But Ross, when you and I were chatting earlier, or a couple of weeks ago, it seemed like having made that shift to deal directly with the consumer, you found that wasn't necessarily necessary. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've witnessed in the changing nature of consumer habits?
Yeah, I think just to sort of firstly put in a bit of perspective, obviously we're a food business. We don't really supply wine, but we supply an on-con. And I can totally agree with Miguel with what he was saying on the wine side, where sort of wine lists have become a lot simpler, and people are buying more sort of luxury brands, happy to spend sort of that extra rand. It certainly happened on the restaurant scene. I mean, last year we tried to, people's favorite word was pivot at the time, and we tried to pivot to get into sort of a B2C market, which is still going, but it's actually our on-trade B2B businesses definitely held fast and carried on growing. I think people's, as you say, in retail, people have sort of shifted over to sort of less expensive products and sort of cut their budgets a bit. But we found it's been, to some degree in the restaurant trade, it's happened, but we have certainly found that people have tried to consolidate their baskets as much as possible. So fewer suppliers, for example, and simplify things on their side in restaurants. We've also found that our customers have really been loyal to the suppliers that looked after them through customer service, levels of customer service. So since COVID started, we haven't changed one element of our distribution schedule. Any element of customer service we've held, and even though it's cost us more with fewer sales, we found that it's actually paid off. Customers are loyal, and like Miguel said, you believe in your product at the end of the day. Don't try and change it. Don't try and sort of change your business model too much, like Paula said. I think it's really held true that customers are very loyal. They've stuck to what they know. They might have sort of chosen where they wanted to cut costs and chosen a cheaper line, but they still chose the brand they know and they trust. they're still buying, and they're still buying the products that they want. They're just maybe buying less because there are fewer customers visiting their restaurants. But yeah, I think certainly, loyalty and customers are definitely buying premium products. And we've sold more caviar in the last 6 months than ever before. So, and that's both to private buyers, but mainly to on-trade.
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I feel like for some small producers sitting at home going, what's going on? You're telling me that everyone is increasing their budget and they're focusing on luxury goods. I wanted to echo what Miguel was saying, that perhaps it comes down to the amount you communicate your brand to the consumer will immediately determine how high you are on that list of priorities. I mean, so you don't necessarily have to be selling directly to the consumer in order to strengthen your brand with them. No. But you told me something interesting about the fact that the number of restaurant clients you guys have had have been growing. And that again seems to be the direct opposite of what everyone is reading or feeling. But you seem to have sensed an optimism that I think some other folk might have missed. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the markets have certainly changed. The average hotel restaurant has been operating like a 30-seater restaurant for the last few months. But yeah, I mean, yes, definitely we've seen a huge growth in active number of restaurants. To give you some figures, I mean, just this year, we've grown active number of restaurants by 26% on last year. And last year, we found it only dipped by 5% on 2019. So definitely, number of active restaurants has certainly grown hugely. I think there's been a huge amount of support from local tourism over the last year. Local tourism, local holiday makers, over weekends, like Miguel said. But yeah, there's been a huge amount of growth in number of restaurants. We've seen also opportunities, restaurants, and I think Matt can elaborate on this, but existing restaurateurs taking up lease opportunities that before COVID, they would never have thought of taking up that lease opportunities. And I think, I mean, historically, rentals and leases have been the biggest killer of restaurants in this country. And landlords have realized that, hey, I need to keep this guy in my center or my building. And they've definitely given a lot of rent relief around to restaurateurs. And I think people have taken, restaurateurs like Matt Manning, like Liam Tomlin, they've taken opportunity of that and opened new establishments. We've seen a bit of speculation from non-restaurateurs as well, seeing the potential of the market and the future of what's coming. There's a lot of optimism. I think Miguel shared it very elaborately. There's a huge amount of optimism in the market at the moment. And yeah, I think there's a lot of support from locals. And I think there's a huge storm coming. We've got the world being vaccinated before our eyes. And I think, unfortunately, our vaccination program is not going to plan. But yeah, I think we saw a great peak season in the Cape over December, and it was purely supported by local tourism. And now this coming season, we are expecting hotels that are being closed, that other 40% of Togosan, I'm sure, is going to be opening. There's already news that the Cape Grace is going to be opening from August. And all these big hotels that have sort of kept quite low key over the last couple of months are opening because they're getting bookings from October. And we're going to have an influx of tourism, foreigners desperate to get out, desperate to travel, desperate to get to their favorite destinations like South Africa. And so we're going to have this huge influx of tourism. Plus, we're still going to have our local travelers who can't necessarily travel all around the world. So like I said, I think there's a perfect storm coming of a tourist season from both foreign travelers and local travelers. Yeah, I think it's definitely, people have seen that opportunity and opened restaurants and sort of tightened their business models. Those who haven't changed their model and their sort of product too much definitely have hung around.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think now's as good a time as any to get Matt Manning to tell us exactly what he's been up to. Anyway, we've referenced him a couple of times, but during lockdown, he seems to have not only maintained himself, but thrived and opened a wine bar culture. So, Matt, can you tell, I mean, you very early on took the opportunity, like Ross was saying, to open culture when everyone else was closing down. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking when you went through that?
Yeah. Hi, John, and thanks for having me on. Well, I think it was about this time last year when I sort of found out that this wonderful space was becoming available. Unfortunately, the previous tenant had to pull out due to what was happening last year in COVID. And I mean, for me, it was a kind of a no-brainer. All the assets were available at super cut prices. The landlord was very happy to agree a heavily reduced rental for a good period of time. And it just sort of gave us the opportunity to add another revenue stream to the business and give another offering, as well as having the extra space for guests so that we could keep our capacity up. And what I've found is, you know, our offering now of culture, wine bar, and grub and vine. Culture is basically picking up the slack of what, you know, we're missing from grub and vine from a normal season, or a normal whatever you can call normal anymore. You know, normal weekday, if you like. I think also culture has kind of diversified my business. In that it's given us another platform to give consumers a different offering. So we've got lots of things happening across the space here. For those of you who don't know my space, it's based on Bree Street, and it's made up of 3 brands: Grub and Vine, the Chef Studio, and Culture Wine Bar. And each of those brands is offering different experiences every week that are open to the public. For example, Culture has a thing called Culture Club on a Tuesday. We run it every Tuesday of the month, and that's a paid for wine tasting, educational wine tasting. Then on Wednesdays, we have a thing called Vine Night, which is a complimentary tasting that's in Grub and Vine. Then Thursdays, we have a thing called Thirsty Thursdays, which Vinimark have come out and done as well in the past, where that's also a complimentary tasting. Just sort of added value offerings to the consumer. And then on Fridays and Saturdays, those are our busiest days, so we don't really need to do anything else to help bring in the foot traffic. But we started recently doing live music Fridays in the bar, but obviously being quite responsible with the current COVID situation, so making sure that there's just table bookings for those sort of things. Yeah, I mean, I think also keeping things quite simple and focusing more on quality over quantity, and I think that speaks for itself when it comes to what's on the menu, the food menu, and of course on the wine list as well. While we do have a completely different wine list in Culture to what we have at Grub and Vine, I think we kind of focus on quality rather than quantity. So if we put a new wine on the wine list, we'll buy in maybe 2 cases and put it on the list. And once it's sold out, we then change it for something else. Again, it goes back to the business model of not over spending and keeping it tight, really. I think over the last 12 months, I've focused mainly on how I'm running my business than actually being in the kitchen, which is, it's been a good learning curve for me, but I haven't enjoyed it that much because I prefer being in the kitchen much more than sitting behind a laptop and looking at the numbers.
But I mean, it sounds like you've been really creative in making each day feel fresh and different for the consumer. And as you say, you've succeeded in bringing people through the door. What would you say are some of the key learnings that you've taken away about this new consumer behavior, or if it is new at all? Are there lessons that you can share to help other restaurateurs in this space?
Well, I wouldn't say that we've reinvented the wheel. I think we've just really focused on our formula of how we do things. I've probably just tightened up the sort of ingredients that we're using on the menu, kept it consistent. I mean, before COVID, it was like, oh, we'll throw on some scallops, which I usually get from Ross, you know. But now it's mainly focusing on, okay, let's make a dish with, you know, some gnocchi with baked potato, and then making that super delicious and having less options on the menu as well. Because I think also the consumer, if you give them too many options, they're kind of spoiled for choice. But I think you can still have an excellent offering with less to choose from, if you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. And then with regards to culture specifically, you've also instituted a membership system, is that correct?
Yeah, basically with the space, once we took it on, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the bar. It was kind of a, you know, it was a no-brainer. But then there's a second floor in the building. It's a 220-year-old heritage building on Bree Street, bang in the middle of town. And the top floor, I knew that we wouldn't be able to use it as a bar space or a restaurant space. It would just cannibalize itself. So instead of, you know, asking the landlord for restaurant bar rates on it, I said, we're going to turn it into a co-working space for people that are in the wine industry. And what we created is a thing called the Wine Library. See it in the background. That's not product placement there. Just happen to be in the Wine Library. We have 3 tiers of membership. Basically, you can join the novel tier, which is 700 rand a month. You get a curated case of wine from Culture. You get your 10% discount members card, and then you can come in and use the space here during the day to do your admin and your you know, have your meetings and use the Wi-Fi. Then there's the trade edition, which is more directed towards people that are in the wine industry, that need a space to do their meetings and have their trade shows during the day, and then be able to have their wines on the shelf. You see the shelves behind me there. So basically every member gets to keep their wines on the shelf, and some of them can go onto the Wine Library list. It's then available for the consumers to purchase in the bar. And we're in the process now of adding the off-consumption license to what we do. And then once tourists come back, we'll host groups of tourists up in the Wine Library for tutored tastings, and then obviously they'll be able to buy to take away with them. And then the final tier is the Tome membership, where you get all the other benefits, and you also just get to keep it's more for the wine connoisseur. So you get to keep your wines on the shelf and then consume them as and when you like.
Sorry, I just had a bit of a distraction here. So have you found that there has been good uptake on that? I mean, are people buying into the system? Because it seems like a clever way to engender loyalty in one sense.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we've done that's helped build our local following. That's definitely one thing I've seen over the last 12 months, is that we've been supported heavily by locals. But again, at the same time, you know, we've been quite active on talking to the local trade as well. So, you know, newsletters and social media, going on from what Miguel was saying. If you're not active, then they're not going to be active towards you either.
I just think that's such a brilliant idea.
Thanks very much.
And I know Bree Street, so I know exactly kind of where it's likely to be. It's exactly the sort of thing that we need more of. We have 67 Pall Mall in London, which is a very different concept to yours, but again, it's built its own following and success, but it's not necessarily really wine trade focused. And I love the fact that you're doing something within the Cape that is a place where a lot of people could actually benefit from.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm actually an admirer of 67 Pall Mall. I think what they do is fantastic.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I think we're now on about 26 members. But, you know, initially we only wanted to have 30 to 40, but now with the new tier of membership, it sort of gives us the leverage to take it up to 100. But it's kind of in place to build a sense of community around the wine industry as well. You know, I think the thing that we've lost with COVID is the opportunity to sit around a table with your peers and create magic. And that's kind of what I wanted to create with the wine library.
We've got Jono back, I think.
Sorry, yeah, are we at the after party already? What did I miss? Sorry, we had a power failure on this end. So I'm not as beautifully lit as I was on. So as I say, Matt, I'm sorry I missed the last part of what you were sharing there. I wanted to quickly go over to Paula again. For what I've picked up a number of times during the conversation, we've been dealing with various players, whether they are sommeliers or suppliers or wine producers, but it feels like where there's been success, there's always been collaboration, or at least a sense of empathy to understand what the other parties need from each other. And Paula, I wondered if you could tell us how producers can position themselves best, especially your producers at Vinimark. How can they position themselves best in order to make it easy to get listed, in order for it to be easy to find themselves on those reduced wine lists? Can you give us some thoughts on that?
I think, John, Robert started the conversation about, you know, getting people to drink wine in restaurants and, you know, expose them to brands. And you said even small producers can pick one or two restaurants, build a relationship and start the process. And I think it's so important. Miguel and I met about just a month ago, actually. And we said that, you know, relationships really drive this industry. Matt, you've alluded to it. Sitting around a table is where the magic happens. And I think ultimately building relationships, understanding people's businesses, you know, understanding what they're doing, what their objectives are, where they're going to, and being specific. I mean, unfortunately, we're not going to list 12 wines from one producer in a restaurant in 90% of cases. So look at their menu, understand what you're going with. They're quite limited with time, and most restaurateurs and sommeliers. So focus, decide what you want and go for it. And I think the other thing is that we said, Miguel alluded to it, and so did Ross, you know, people want quality, and there's such a great offering in South Africa in terms of quality. Most wines that I get to sell have many awards, are really drinkable, are delicious. So it comes down to just having that little bit of extra, making sure that you're in the consumer's face as much as you can, be active on social media, and engage as much as you can. I think a lot of people have been quite quiet and sort of retracted back to the farm. And I think it's the time to get out, not physically necessarily, but just engage. We've got this amazing platform, and we've done some incredible online tastings. And having somebody like Robert from the UK just reminds us that we actually are in a global world, and we can chat and communicate. And I think that's ultimately what we can do better.
Can I chip in quickly there?
Please, yeah.
Well, firstly, I didn't say before, earlier on I was talking in a global context. The first thing I'm going to say is the quality of South African wines. I want to actually support what everybody else has been saying, both inside and South Africa, outside, about the quality of the wines. And I speak as one who was in the Cape in the late 80s and 90s, where a lot of people in Britain were being nice about South African wine, and I wasn't. So I think that there's really been an extraordinary explosion of quality over the last 20, 30 years, particularly 20 years, I'd say. And it's literally every vintage we're seeing great new things happening. So that's the first thing. Secondly, as a place to visit, you know, you are spoiled. You've got so much there. But I'm just going to pick up on something very specific just from what you've just saying, Paula. I think that people, when they go out, I think they may want more entertainment I think the casual of I'm just going to go out and eat some food out that I could have cooked at home may not be as easy to do. And to me, it's whether you're a restaurant in terms of the quality of the service or the environment, the ambience, everything. It's like the chef's table that we heard about earlier. But it's also in terms of the wineries. And there's a lot of discussion in the States going on about whether the tasting room boom in Napa has actually come down, and a lot of those wineries in the Cape and in Napa are looking at opening tasting rooms elsewhere and doing other things. But you've got in the audience, I noticed Carolyn Martin from Creation, and I am an absolute, I've been described, I think, as a creationist somewhere. I'm a total fan of what Carolyn has done down at the end of, when I went there, it was almost an unpassable road, which is obviously a better road now. But to me, what I see about that and the other, and so many of the best wineries in South Africa, when you visit a winery today, a farm, you actually do have more than, oh, I can taste some wines and I can buy some wines. There's food, there's not just food, there's the gardens to visit, there's art, there's lots of things. And I think that's one of the biggest changes I've seen, apart from the quality of the wine in South Africa and elsewhere. But I think your wine tourism offering is now extraordinarily good. And it's something that needs to be communicated back to the point that was being made earlier by Miguel. I want to see that on social media. I want to be sitting in London or Berlin or New York, and I want to actually get the experience of what I would get when I come to South Africa. Because when people travel, where are they going to go? What is going to make them come to this farm or that farm, or indeed South Africa rather than somewhere else?
Fantastic. Well, I feel like we're towards the end of our conversation now. I'm not sure if anyone wanted to add to what Robert was saying, but it feels like if I were to take away just a few points from today's discussion, first of all, it's that optimism is high, which is not something I expected coming into this conversation, which is encouraging. But I take what Paula said right at the beginning when she said the people who have perhaps done the best are those who've acknowledged upfront that we're not going back to the old normal, that the things have changed. But immediately what came after that was a statement about the relational connection. And I think what that tells me is that the normal may have changed, but people haven't. And people are still looking for entertainment. They're still looking for connection. And so businesses that can do that best are the ones that are going to thrive. And we compared the big guys and perhaps a marketing budget that they may have. But what often is missing there is the ability to connect in a personal way that a smaller business might be able to do. And I think that's hugely important. Ross, you talked about the fact that there's a big storm coming. I assume you meant a storm of opportunity, and that's something that guys need to be preparing for now. And finally, I think what was most striking for me was the idea that communicating on social media feels like a soft touch or something that doesn't immediately yield results. But Miguel, you said you're just the gatekeeper. It's actually the consumer that puts the demand on you to place certain wines and certain producers on the list. And that if producers can get out, or restaurants and wine bars can get out and strengthen their brand and position themselves more boldly, that does lead back to you finding yourself on more wine lists and having more end consumers drink your wines, which I think is hugely important. So thank you so much to Paula, to Miguel, to Robert, Ross, Matt. I've really enjoyed hearing your sharing. Are there any major points that perhaps I've missed that you guys think producers need to hear in this instance? I don't think there's any questions from the panel. Anareth, are there any questions? No.
No, Jono. No questions.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We've been just over an hour and we endured a power failure and my son's toe nearly fell off. So that's a lot of fun. And for those of you who enjoyed today's chat, don't forget that Vinimark has a YouTube channel. We also release podcasts where we talk about industry issues and new developments, the science, the technology of it all, as well as the consumer-facing elements. So you can go onto Apple Music or onto Spotify, onto Deezer, and you can hear these conversations or watch these on YouTube. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thanks.
Yes.